war in Afghanistan has gone on and on and on. It is now the longest war in U.S. history. The UN is not in a position to be the third party to bring the opposing sides together because it is one of the parties. And how the UN is going to work the next months out or next 2 years out as the last of the foreign troops leave is something to watch. In addition, new problems have come up, the use of drones and the use of airspace in countries across the border. So the Afghanistan war has raised a whole series of things which were not anticipated in the Charter and which pose serious difficulties, some of which are just beginning to be touched on in the world as we now know it. That was Afghanistan. Iraq in 2003, the U.S. and the coalition invaded Iraq without the approval of the UN. The UN played a part in trying to set up a government in Baghdad and did set up some of the voting procedures that were going on there. The key player there was Lakhdar Brahimi, and he is playing a key role elsewhere. He's a figure to watch, I'd say, in the next several years because of his experience with the UN. So that was a case where the UN did not encourage the invasion, and the UN has had a certain amount of leverage. Libya in 2011 was, again, complicated. The issue had been raised about the responsibility to protect. In the first phase of the war in Libya was the notion that Muammar Gaddafi was about to destroy members of his own country. And the notion of the responsibility to protect was an issue that had been discussed in the UN. So the UN went in initially with the sort of thesis of the responsibility to protect, and the US and the coalition bombed Libya. The UN was the one that recognized the international the tribunal that replaced Gaddafi, so the UN played a role in the sort of outside of this thing. But now the question is, as we see what's been happening in Libya, what are the results of this kind of half involvement in the war in which the UN did back the support of an aerial attack in Libya with a whole series of complications. And then we come to the current one, Syria, in 2012, and the fact that the UN again has played a key role, probably preventing the US from going in at the time of the chemical discovery. Had the UN not been there and had the ability to inspect the chemical weapons, it's very possible the US would have launched a war, which would be an extremely complicated situation right now. Again, the UN envoy Lakhdar Brahimi was a key person and played a key part in Geneva I and Geneva II talks. To the extent there's any person or body working on a peaceful resolution to this very complicated situation, the UN is there. At the moment, the chaos in Syria, the fact that the Islamic State has emerged, is part of the incredibly complicated situation that has resulted from the past several years. I want to look briefly now at surprises. If you go back to 1945, the UN set up a number of things that it thought might work. We looked at the preamble, we looked at Chapter 6, we looked at Chapter 7. There are three types of things the UN is doing today which they had never envisioned, as far as I can tell, back in 1945, which have emerged because there was a group there and they saw a need to be done. First of all, peacekeeping. There's nothing in the UN Charter about peacekeeping, and yet if there were one thing the UN has done perhaps most effectively, it has been the establishment of these peacekeeping missions. The first one to come into existence was in 1948 between Israel and its neighbors. Shortly thereafter, you had a war in India and Pakistan. So there have been peacemaking missions going on virtually since the beginning of the UN. In this year, there are 97,000 peacekeepers actively engaged in 122 countries. So here's sort of a quiet activity that the UN is doing that it never anticipated doing, but somebody had to do it, and the UN was there. It hasn't always been perfect, but when one thinks of what will be happening without these peacekeeping missions, one heaves a certain sigh of relief. The Nobel Peace Prize has been won several times by UN peacekeepers. So that was one surprise that he got. Second surprise, UN supervising elections. Typically, when a resolution is achieved, the question comes, how do people express their opinion? And how do you know the opinion that's expressed is actually what people are saying? The general thing that the UN does is to provide technical assistance, because getting voter lists, getting ballot boxes, getting secure voting is something the UN is very, very good at doing. If you want to pick a particular election, the UN played a crucial part. It was in 1993 in Cambodia. Cambodia had been the scene of devastation. The Vietnam War had spilled over into it. And Pol Pot was there. The Vietnamese had invaded. And then finally there was a peace, and there had to be an election. And there probably was no group in the world that could have held an election that would make it possible for peace to come back to Cambodia after that period had taken place. So that was the second sort of surprise. The third thing, and this is very touching, but it's actually happened. The UN has made it possible for certain groups to secede from other groups. Growing up in Kurdistan, and I am a Kurd, kind of, I've known for a long time that the Kurdish people have hoped for a homeland. But there's no way they can get a homeland now, because the Kurds are divided in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And if any one of them said we'd like to be independent, they would be immediately attacked. In fact, the last 2 weeks, two days, the news from Turkey has been one of great concern. They don't want to give the Kurds too much support because there might be a section of Turkey carved out to become Kurdistan. In 2012, the UN actually made it possible for a section of the country to secede from that country. This was Sudan and South Sudan. That was something miraculous. The civil war had been going on for decades with enormous suffering on both sides. And finally it was possible to set up a process where the Sudanese could say, we're better off if we have a Sudan and a South Sudan. One looks at other parts of the world, the Basques in Spain, the Kurds, people in Quebec, people in Scotland who said we'd like to be separate from where we are. How can one do it democratically and fairly? And how can one do it without having to go to war? So I come to sort of wind up my talk. And this, we do come back to the UN Association. The U.S. has not been the best member of the United Nations. During the George Bush administration, we had John Bolton, who was sort of clearly opposed to the purposes of the UN. The U.S. has not paid its arrears for a long time. The U.S. has walked out of UNESCO. The U.S. has walked out of the ILO. In many ways, the U.S. has resented the fact that the UN has not always said that what the U.S. has been doing is the greatest thing in the world. So the UN Association represents a group of people in the United States who are committed to the idea of the UN being a powerful and effective group, recognizing its limitations, also recognize the way in which it is adapted to the needs, coming up with things it never thought of, like peacekeeping or the technology of elections, and has filled these gaps that nobody else could possibly fill. So, what can the UN Association do? The UN Association in the United States can insist that the U.S. pay its dues. It's embarrassing to be looking at the richest country in the world that has been quibbling over paying dues because of the desire to change the formula of dues payments. Limiting the concept of U.S. exceptionalism. President Obama referred recently to the U.S. as an exceptional nation, and we can see, yes, it is, but also we are not entitled to benefit from certain responsibilities which we are obliged to carry out. And here I think a group of U.S. citizens watching the fact that the U.S. has dodged out of things that it should have stayed in. For example, the Rome Convention. The fact that we've walked away from that, that's something that the U.S. population and the members of the UN Association should insist change. Encouraging the U.S. to become a world citizen. We are talking about world citizens. The U.S. can become a model. We go back to Eleanor Roosevelt and the very founding of the UN, and this was an ideal. Franklin Roosevelt spoke about it 2 years before his death. Eleanor Roosevelt played a key part. And yet you look at a series of presidents recently, especially the Bush family and Ronald Reagan, and they were anything but enthusiastic about the UN, and in many ways tried to extricate themselves from their responsibilities. The UN Association can say, look, the UN, for all its faults, is indispensable. The UN has adapted, it's changed, it's playing a crucial role. It needs all the support we can get, and the US should become a leading world citizen. On that note. Thank you.
So now we want to present Joe with a plaque. To the UNA USA Dane County chapter presents the 2014 Global Citizen Award to Joseph Elder for his peacekeeping in Kashmir, Vietnam, Korea, and Sri Lanka, and promoting the work of the United Nations. Presented at Madison, Wisconsin, October 21st, 2014. Barbara Nichols, chapter president, a well-deserved award.
Thank you, Barbara.
Do you want to answer any questions? Do you want to take any questions? Or do you want to
I can say that.
Is there anybody that has a burning question or two you'd like to ask Joe? Otherwise, he'll be around to socialize. There's still some food, perhaps. There's drink. And we have the room for another 55 minutes. John?
The story I wanted to ask you to tell, I hope I'm remembering this correctly. Waning years or waning months of World War II, and Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt were meeting. And you as a high school band student, I think that's sort of an inside track to knowing about this. But with that, of course, they met, and I just wonder if you could reflect briefly on the importance of conversations like that one in the context of the UN and other places to move us toward peace.
The story isn't anywhere near as great as it sounds. I was 12 years old, not playing a great part in world peace, but I was living in Tehran, and among the many friends we had in Tehran, there was a big American military base, the Persian Gulf Command it was called, and they were shipping supplies from the Persian Gulf up to the Soviet Union to provide them with jeeps and planes and tanks and weapons to fight against the Germans. One of the people we met in the American base at Amirabad, just north of Tehran, was a farm boy named Jimmy Drake, who played the trombone in the first AFS band. And Jimmy Drake loved teenagers, and he came over and taught songs and square dancing. And one day Jimmy Drake showed up, and he spoke to my dad. He said, Reverend Elder, does anybody ever play Hail to the Chief unless the president's there? And my father, who knew everything, said, no, I can't imagine anybody playing Hail to the Chief if the president isn't there. And Jimmy Drake said, well, we're starting to practice Hail to the Chief. That must mean President Roosevelt is coming to Tehran. So at that point, I was in on a world secret, which probably the Germans and Japanese would have given a great deal of treasure to know. Because when Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin met, they met probably 6 blocks from where I was. And we did get to see the limousines going in and out. And that was the Tehran conference, which was subsequently followed by the Yalta conference, and then ultimately came the founding of the UN. So I might say at the age of 12, I played a very minor part. But knowing a secret which was extremely valuable, I have no idea how important it was. Thank you, John, for the question.
Let's take, is there one more question people like to ask, and then we'll break for informal conversation?
Tell us about Vietnam, when you were in Vietnam.
I know this story is very interesting.
Okay, I went to North Vietnam in 1969. Richard Nixon had just been elected president, and he was elected president in part because he had a solution to the Vietnam problem. The American Friends Service Committee took advantage of the fact that Richard Nixon referred periodically to his mother, who was a Quaker, and so they wrote a letter to Richard Nixon saying that his concerns for peace and our concerns for peace may have had some overlap. Could we meet and talk with him? A letter came back saying that he himself was not free to meet with us, but he had his advisor in Vietnam, who was Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger would be prepared to meet with us. So on a particular day in June of 1969, we were in a protest in front of the White House urging the end of the Vietnam War. And then at that particular point, the police came and took the 6 of us who had been selected to go into the basement of the White House to meet Henry Kissinger. The first thing Henry Kissinger said was, "Is this on the record or off the record?" And we said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Well, if it's on the record, then we can stop right now, because you have read what I've said, and I will just say what's on the record. If it's off the record, then I might say something else, but then you can't tell anybody what I told you. And if you do, I'll deny it." So we were caught in this position. We were part of a protest. We went in, and then we came back out and said, "Well, we just had a great talk with Richard Nixon, and it was not going to go over very well." So we decided in a brief huddle that we would go off the record with the understanding that we would not talk about it when we got out. Well, the upshot of that was that I ended up being in Hanoi within the next month to speak as a representative of the Quakers. We were providing medical supplies for civilian victims in North Vietnam. And while I was there, one other thing in this meeting we then met him again in July when they came back. And the North Vietnamese, when I was there, said, "Who is making the U.S. policy toward Vietnam? Is it the President, Nixon? Is it Henry Kissinger? Or is it the Secretary of State?" And I said, "I have no idea, since I'm not in the inner circle, but I think my guess is probably Henry Kissinger is the major planner of the U.S. Vietnam policy." So they said to me, "We know that the Paris peace talks are being negotiated. Much point is being made of the fact that peace might come from the Paris peace talks. But we also know that diplomats often say they're interested in peace, but they really aren't interested in peace at all. So could you convey a message that if the United States, if Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon are serious about the Paris peace talks, could they give us a signal? And the signal would be that for 2 months they would stop the Phoenix exercise." The Phoenix was a civilian assassination project in South Vietnam. And sort of everybody knew about it. The Wall Street Journal had a couple of articles about Phoenix. There's a case where in South Vietnam, if the government felt somebody was too sympathetic to the Viet Cong or to the North Vietnamese, they would simply execute them or they would disappear. Everybody was doing it. I mean, it wasn't just the South, but the North Koreans were, and the Viet Cong were as well. So in the next meeting in August of 1969, we were back, the same group of people in the basement of the White House. And when my turn came, I said, I was in Hanoi, I was speaking with leaders of the North Vietnamese, and they did ask, if you're serious, they understand you may not be, because the world of diplomacy is a world of a great deal of hypocrisy, and we have to acknowledge that, but if you are serious, let us know by stopping Operation Phoenix for 2 months. There was this pause. Then Henry Kissinger said to his aide, "What is Operation Phoenix?" Now, at that point, I leave it up to everybody here to figure out whether he really didn't know, whether he thought we didn't know, whom he thought he was kidding. But it was clear that something sort of weird was going on. At the end of the meeting in August, he did say, "Our plan is working, we think. We can't tell you what it is, but if by December," now this is 1969, "if by December the war in Vietnam isn't very close to concluded, I give the Quakers permission to come back to the White House and tear down the gates." And that was August of 1969. The U.S. left Vietnam in 1972, and the Vietnamese War in 1975. So here was a central planner who was sufficiently out of touch with the real world to imagine that the war was almost over. And when you are that close to powerful people, you realize how entirely off the target they can be. It lends that much support for any of us being critical of any policies our country has. So the UN went in initially with the sort of thesis of the responsibility to protect, and the U.S. and the coalition bombed Libya. The UN was the one that recognized the international the tribunal that replaced Gaddafi. So the UN played a role in the sort of outside of this thing. But now the question is, as we see what's been happening in Libya, what are the results of this kind of half involvement in the war in which the UN did back the support of an experience with the UN. So that was a case where the UN did not encourage the invasion, and the UN has had a certain amount of leverage. Libya in 2011 was, again, complicated. The issue had been raised about the responsibility to protect. In the first phase of the war in Libya was the notion that Muammar Gaddafi was about to destroy members of his own country. And the notion of the responsibility to protect was an issue that had been discussed in the UN, in the Charter, and which posed serious difficulties, some of which are just beginning to be touched on in the world as we now know it. That was Afghanistan. Iraq in 2003, the U.S. and the coalition invaded Iraq without the approval of the UN. The UN played a part in trying to set up a government in Baghdad and did set up some of the voting procedures that were going on there. The key player there was Lakhdar Brahimi, and he is playing a key role elsewhere. He's a figure to watch, I'd say, in the next several years, because of his war in Afghanistan is going on and on and on. It is now the longest war in U.S. history. The UN is not in a position to be the third party to bring the opposing sides together because it is one of the parties. And how the UN is going to work the next months out or next 2 years out as the last of the foreign troops leave is something to watch. In addition, new problems have come up, the use of drones and the use of airspace in countries across the border. So the Afghanistan war has raised a whole series of things which were not anticipated. Aerial attack in Libya with a whole series of complications. And then we come to the current one, Syria in 2012, and the fact that the UN again has played a key role, probably preventing the U.S. from going in at the time of the chemical discovery. Had the UN not been there and had the ability to inspect the chemical weapons, it's very possible the U.S. would have launched a war, which would be an extremely complicated situation right now. Again, the UN envoy